Perón was elected to the presidency in 1946 on the back of a mass movement that saw him as a remedy to the rot that had developed in Argentina's political system during the last decade and a half of military and oligarchic rule. The rhetoric of his campaign and early government pitted the Argentine people against a corrupt oligarchy and all of its lackeys among Argentina's established political parties. And many of Peronism's upper class and middle class opponents feared that they would be targeted for reprisal killings by the Peronists as soon as Perón came to power. But widespread political violence was incompatible with Perón's goals for Argentina. Perón was a military man after all. He valued order and obedience, and he had a frankly elitist and condescending attitude towards the workers and labor activists who had gotten him elected. Perón's vision for Argentina was not one of conflict, but of harmony and cooperation between the state, organized labor, and big business, each of which would have an important part to play in setting the country back on course. Perón did not want to demobilize his movement because he needed this movement to protect him from his enemies. But during the early years of his presidency, Perón does work to bring the movement more fully under his control in order to tame it and prevent it from getting in the way. In order to understand how this movement changes during Perón's years in power, we first need to take stock of what the movement looks like at the time of Perón's inauguration in 1946. At the movement's heart are Perón and Evita. Perón is El General, the grand leader who is supposed to stand above the fray and serve as mediator for the other parts of the movement. Evita's status in the movement initially comes mainly from her association with her husband, Juan Perón. But especially by the last couple years of her life, she begins to form her own power base within the movement. She forges an alliance with the labor wing of Peronism, and she develops an independent capacity to influence the course of events within the movement. After the Perón couple, the next most important pillar of the early Peronist movement is the labor movement, based on the labor organization, the CGT, and the Labor Party. Perón supporters within the labor movement come from a variety of backgrounds. The most prominent Peronist labor leaders come from either revolutionary syndicalist or socialist traditions, and they include several former members of the Socialist Party who had become alienated from their party during the dictatorships of the 30s and 40s. Far fewer anarchist and communist labor leaders migrate to Peronism, though there are at least a couple of activists and unions from these traditions. In addition to the labor movement, Perón also has the support of the progressive or Irigoyenista wing of the Radical Civic Union, which has definitively split off from the rest of the party during the run-up to the 1946 election. Compared to the labor activists, the Peronist radicals are smaller in number, but they also have greater experience in organizing a political party. There is also a group of relatively elite figures within the Peronist movement who have personal ties to Perón, including other military officers, businessmen, large landowners, and academics, and many of Perón's closest friends end up as provincial governors or cabinet-level officials in his administration. Finally, there is a large number of people who do not fit into any of these other categories and who support Perón and Peronism on a more individual basis. Some are attracted to Peronism because of its nationalism or its rhetoric about social justice. Some are attaching themselves to this movement in the hope of receiving a job in the Peronist administration, while others may simply be looking to settle some old scores with Peronism's opponents. Peronism is a majority movement at the time when it comes to power in 1946. But because each of its component parts support Perón for very different reasons, there is a significant risk that the movement will fray or even disintegrate once Perón is forced to confront the realities of governing and all of the compromises that come with it. Early on in his presidency, Perón mitigates this possibility by forcing the two largest and most powerful segments of the movement to dissolve their parties so that they cannot be used against him in the future. He then reorganizes each of the component parts of the Peronist movement into a single party that he can control. This party is initially called the Sole Party of the Revolution, but it soon becomes known as simply the Peronist Party. At the head of the Peronist Party is Perón himself. The party's statutes specify that Perón is the supreme leader of the party, and they grant him the authority to reorganize, replace, or even dissolve other parts of the party unilaterally. Directly below Perón is the Superior Council, which consists of the senior party leaders who have direct personal ties to Perón. The Superior Council oversees and controls the party's various provincial and local branches from the top down. The Peronist Party of the 40s and early 50s is a mass membership party, and it claims over 2 million members by the late 40s, though reported party membership figures in Latin America should always be taken with a grain of salt. Peronist Party members are allowed to organize themselves into base units called unidades básicas at either the neighborhood or factory level. The party members in the básicas normally elect the party's local and provincial leadership bodies. And in some cases, there are genuine competitive elections for the mid-level leadership during the late 40s. However, the influence of the party membership over the mid-level party leadership is greatly constrained in practice. First, Perón and the Superior Council have the right to veto entire candidate slates in these elections. Second, Perón and the Superior Council also have the authority to intervene in the mid-level leadership body, remove all of their members, and fill them with their preferred candidates. And this makes internal elections effectively meaningless as a way to influence the direction of the party, though they do still serve as a useful tool for leadership and candidate recruitment that helps signal to Perón which mid-level leaders have the most popular support within the party. Based on the way that I have just described it, the Peronist Party might sound like a rigid or even militaristic party like Peru's APRA or the National Revolutionary Party of Mexico, but the Peronist Party really wasn't. Perón kept the party organization in a constant state of chaos. Throughout his years in office, he was constantly tweaking its statutes, dissolving and replacing its leadership bodies, and removing party leaders without warning. The Peronist Party organization was so anarchic that some political scientists have seriously questioned whether the Peronist Party even existed at all during the late 40s and early 50s. One of Perón's many tweaks to the party organization is the creation of a branch structure based on a women's branch, a labor branch, and a political branch that grouped together everyone else who didn't fit into the other two branches. If you watch the video on the Party of the Mexican Revolution, then this three-branch structure should remind you a lot of how Lázaro Cárdenas reorganized his party in 1938. Both party organizations are based on similar corporatist principles. In the case of the Peronist Party, each branch theoretically had an equal quota of positions on the party's candidate lists and party leadership bodies. This implied that 1/3 of the Peronist seats in Congress were supposed to be held by labor activists, and a second third was supposed to be held by women. Though this rule was only loosely enforced in practice, and it was a purely informal arrangement that was not part of the party's official statutes. The Peronist Party's women's wing is initially led by Evita, and it is the most organizationally autonomous of the three branches.
luchadora que trabaja y que lucha para el bien de la nación, la que mañana en la urna para valer.
The women's wing maintains its own semi-separate party organization called the feminine Peronist Party, along with its own unidades básicas. As a result, women occupy a greater share of the Peronist Party's seats in Congress and leadership positions than just about any other major Latin American party at this moment in history. But the influence of the women's wing is largely dependent on Evita herself, and the women's wing loses much of its importance after her death in 1952. The labor branch of the Peronist Party never really acquires its own party structure, but it does have some organizational coherence thanks to the Peronists' hegemonic control over the country's largest labor federation, the CGT. The labor movement is largely subordinated to Perón by the late 40s, and Perón effectively selects the leaders of the major labor unions that are under Peronist control, rather than leaving this decision up to their membership. The Peronist union leadership also actively suppresses strikes during Perón's years in power, and labor activists who carry out wildcat strikes can face severe repercussions. For the activists who had founded the Labor Party to support Perón's presidential campaign in 1946, the dissolution of their party and the subordination of the labor movement to Perón was a profound disappointment that made many labor leaders turn away from Peronism. But this disappointment was largely outweighed by the unprecedented level of power that the workers gained in the workplace during Perón's government. During the first few years of Perón's presidency, most of the major industries develop a system of internal commissions that are elected by the workers of each factory. The main purpose of these commissions is to oversee working conditions in the factory and verify that management is complying with both its contract and with the national labor laws. But in some cases, these internal commissions also challenge management's control over the factory's day-to-day operations. And importantly, management is strictly prohibited from firing or even disciplining the members of these internal commissions while they are in office. This system is still very far from worker-managed factories, but it becomes an important symbol of the working class's greater assertiveness and defiance during Perón's government. Although the unidades básicas have only a limited role in the party's decision-making structure, they are among the most autonomous and effective parts of the Peronist organization. The unidades básicas are essentially Peronist political clubs that are formed by small teams of Peronist activists from the same neighborhood or factory. And they become an important tool for proselytization and for keeping the Peronist identity alive. By the late 40s, many unidades básicas come to serve functions similar to the Aprista Casas del Pueblo in Peru, and they provide various social assistance services to Peronist supporters in their area, such as medical services. Another way that the Peronists keep the spirit of their movement alive during their years in power is by holding regular rallies. These rallies serve to demonstrate the Peronist movement's mass support and legitimize Perón's administration as a people's government. But they also play a role in binding this diverse and multifaceted movement together. The Peronist Party itself is segmented into thousands of separate organizations, but all of the movement's component parts are mixed together on the Plaza de Mayo during the annual celebrations of Perón's release on October 17th and International Workers' Day on May 1st. While Peronist activists do most of their week-to-week party work with the same dozen or so people who are part of their unidad básica, when they turn out at the rallies, they recognize that they are part of a nationwide movement that remains every bit as formidable and passionate as it was on October 17th, 1945, when it all first began. And so at the end of the day, we are left with a chaotic and disorganized political party organization that nevertheless has deep and enthusiastic mass support at the very bottom of this organization. And this raises the question of why Perón did not try to organize this base of mass support into a more effective party in the way that Lázaro Cárdenas did in Mexico. Part of the reason was that the anarchic nature of the party actually helped Perón maintain better control over the movement because it ensured that everything had to pass through him personally. A second factor was that Perón did not really need a stronger party than the one that he already had, because the Peronist Party did not face any immediate risk of ever losing an election. The Peronists already held 2/3 of Congress after the 1946 legislative election. The 1948 election almost exactly replicates the 1946 result. Then after the 1951 election, the Peronists gained control over more than 90% of Congress, and their share of Congress continues to increase slightly in the 1954 election. Behind this Peronist majority in the electorate is a widespread sense that Perón cumple, or Perón delivers. His government may not have been as radical as some of his labor supporters had hoped, but he does enact many policies that are incredibly popular with a majority of Argentine voters, and especially with his working class supporters. He nationalizes the mostly foreign-owned railroad system. He greatly increases the workers' wages. He establishes an unusually strong welfare state by Latin American standards, and he carries out various public infrastructure projects. All of this is popular with his voters, and Perón's supporters understand that there is a very good chance that many of these gains will be reversed as soon as the opposition comes to power. Perón takes full advantage of his popular support by changing the electoral rules for Congress in his favor and switching from a semi-proportional system to a single-member district system similar to the one used in the United States, Canada, the UK, and India. Under the old system, 1/3 of the seats in each province-wide district would go to the second largest party. But under the new system, provinces are divided into several separate districts, and each district seat goes to the party that wins the most votes in that district. And in a country with a fractured opposition, the party that wins the most votes is usually going to be the Peronist Party. This change in the electoral rules makes it that much harder for opposition parties to win representation in Congress while Perón is in power. The opposition parties are also weakened by repression. Perón's 1946 to 1955 government was not especially repressive by the standards of the Argentine governments that came both before and after it. But the Peronist government did harass opposition parties and denied them access to the media. And by the end of Perón's presidency, several of the most prominent opposition leaders are in prison. This repression was not necessary for Perón to hold on to power. but it does have the effect of disrupting the opposition and making it even harder for opposition parties to organize an effective electoral challenge to Peronism. And so, although the Peronist Party is weak and chaotic, it is more than strong enough to get Peronists elected to office at all levels of government. Even after the economic downturn of the early 1950s, Perón and his allies face no significant risk of losing an election anytime soon. Instead, Perón's Achilles heel was not his party, but rather the military. During Perón's final 2 years in office, conservative factions of the military carried out several mutinies and outright attacks on Perón's government and supporters, including an aerial bombing of a Peronist rally on the Plaza de Mayo that leaves several hundred Peronists dead. Then, in September 1955, the military stages a coup that forces Perón out of office and sends him into exile. The Peronist Party is forcibly dissolved and banned by the military. The military dictatorship dismisses Peronists from government positions, and it bans all images of Perón and Evita, Peronist music, and even public mentions of the Peronist government. The military understands that it is not enough to topple the man Perón. In order to ensure that Perón never returns, it must erase Peronism itself from the national memory. But there is just one problem. Perón's supporters are not ready to stop being Peronists. Their leader may be gone and their party may be gone. But the Peronists themselves are going to continue fighting, and they are not going to settle for anything less than the political restoration of Juan Domingo Perón.